The Anchor of Vul. 745.m32. Teleportation was always a dangerous and risky endeavor. To pass through the Empyrean, however briefly, was not something the weak-minded could survive, and even the greatest and strongest-willed warrior was at the mercy of chance's cruel whims. Such were the tactical advantages the technology provided, however, that generations of humanity's finest have continued to make use of it despite the hideous risks it presented, and the countless martyrs who had been lost in transit, condemned to a fate infinitely worse than death. The Fire of Dawn's teleportarium was a relic from the dark age of technology, scavenged from the ruins the heresy had made of Mars' once great forged cities without the tech priest's knowledge and secretly added into the battle barge's structure. It was far bigger and more reliable than those used by other Space Marine chapters, capable of displacing entire companies of warriors at the same time. It had delivered the Grey Knights to hundreds of battlefields, and only very rarely taken the life of even one of them in return. It was also the only teleportation device in the entire Imperial, and probably Eldar, fleet capable of penetrating the shroud of space-time anomalies that surrounded the Anchor of Vul. Even that had its limits. The closer to the singularity atop the anchor it tried to lock, the worse the conditions got. In the end, they had aimed for a point behind the known enemy lines, a few dozen kilometers above the floor where the Allied forces had disembarked inside the anchor. 108 Grey Knights materialized inside a maintenance corridor vast enough for an Imperator Titan to walk across it, accompanied by 3 Inquisitors and their most trustworthy and deadly agents. Most Grey Knights present belonged to the 2nd and 8th Brotherhoods, with a few squads from the other Brotherhoods who had been present on Titan when the distress call from Azeroth had arrived. There had been more, but over half the strength they had been able to muster had needed to be scattered across the sector, to prevent threats no less apocalyptic than the Nightmare Fleet to come to pass. Those who remained would be enough to stop the great madness of the Awakened One. They would have to be. Surrounded by monsters and with an hourglass in front of him, Aasim waited. The Sorcerer Lord knelt beneath a ceiling of black metal and silver lines that pulsed with light. The floor beneath him was a perfectly reflective surface, the reason for which he couldn't begin to guess. By the standards of this place, the ceiling was low, barely 10 meters above the head of the sorcerers. The glow of eye lenses and smoldering hellfire was reflected above and below, adding to the silver illumination and casting the sorcerers of the Coven and their creations in sinister and shifting shadows. They were a terrible sight, of the kind Imperial preachers might have used to threaten the unfaithful with if their imagination was not so laughably limited. 6 demon lords, incarnated within the bodies of cloned Primarchs. 79 demon hosts, held only by the loosest of bindings. Thousands of dark Mechanicum Scutari and their heretic handlers, in whose augmetics and flesh coursed the warp-born lightning of Argenta Primus. It was a host capable of laying waste to worlds, a parade of horrors that could bring Space Marine chapters to extinction, and trigger demonic incursions and pandemonium across entire systems. But Aasim had witnessed the might of the Grey Knights, and it doubted it would be enough. Slowly, inevitably, the hourglass grains fell down. The glass had been made from the sand of a beach where 100 battles had been fought between warring nations. The grains within were the ashes of a king, and the wadden support from a tree that had been watered with the blood of human sacrifices for 1,000 years. In the correct hands, the hourglass was a powerful ritual tool, capable of rending the veil of reality and bring forth the hosts of chaos in all their dark glory. Right now, however, its sole purpose was to mark the passage of time. Arkan had ordered Aasim that, when the hourglass was empty, he was to take all the monsters with him and go find the heirs of Sanguinius and the guardsmen, slaughter them all, feed their souls to the Neverborn and make new demon hosts of their corpses. But the Awakened One had also warned him that as long as Aasim fully intended to obey that order, he would never have to. Such a pronouncement might seem strange, and a cause for concern coming from someone as steeped in the powers of the warp as Aasim's liege lord was. But Arkan wasn't going mad. Aasim had understood his implication without needing to be told. So long as his decision to take his host against the Imperial forces was certain, the Grey Knights would come to stop him. After all, if the Imperials were dead, the Forsaken Sons would be able to focus their forces to wipe out the Elders, and after that, the Grey Knights would be overwhelmed and butchered. Facing them now was the only way they could hope to accomplish their mission, which meant that it was guaranteed the Knights of Titan would come into his trap. They simply didn't have a choice. To manipulate your enemy so that they were forced to do what you wanted them to do even if they realized the trap, such was the beauty of Arkan's design, the same vision that had scattered the might of the Grey Knights across Azeroth, turning the hammer of the false emperor into a much frailer arrow. Of course, the arrow could still kill if it reached its target, which was why Asim intended to make sure the Grey Knights didn't go any further. In the hourglass, the last grain of ash fell down. Asim looked up, toward the door at the end of the room, one of many leading into this chamber. It was opening, and behind it he saw the glint of silver armor. He felt the familiar presences of the Grey Knights, burning at the edge of his perception like a flame held too close to the skin. There were other souls, mortal ones, the killers of the Inquisition, no doubt, sent alongside the Grey Knights to provide what little support they could. He recognized some of them from when he and Carthago had crippled the organization. And there was another soul, too, one Asim felt he should recognize but did not. It was powerful, its power blazing in the Empyrean with the same sort of power Arkan now possessed, though its nature was entirely opposite to the Awakened One's. The Sorcerer of Blood smiled as he stood up. It was a cold and bitter smile, hidden under his helm, but it was a smile nonetheless. Plus and now comma plus he silently sent to his brothers and their creations, plus we begin. Plus. The first of the monsters had been born of Angron's blood. Fleshmaster Savar Khan had used the vitae of 20 former World Eaters, spilled in the Hand of Ruin's gladiatorial pits, and the gene seed of 10 more as the basis for this child of woe. It was over 3.5 meters tall, with a body made of bleeding muscle and pearl-white bone. The axe it held in its clawed hands was only an imitation of Gorefather and Gorechild, the Red Angel's legendary weapons, but that didn't make it any less deadly. With a single swipe, it cut through 3 Grey Knights, before over 20 storm bolters opened fire on it at once. Dozens of blessed shells slammed into its incarnate form, obliterating it and sending the Demon Lord within back to the warp for the first time in thousands of years. There were still 5 more coming behind it, and the sight of their kindred's destruction didn't trouble them. They enjoyed the strong bodies Asim had provided them, but even banishment to the realms of chaos was a step up from their former imprisonment, and the bargain binding them to the Forsaken Sun's cause was ironclad. Besides, they too hated the Grey Knights, and reveled in the opportunity to spill the blood of the Anathema's last creations. And so, as the sorcerers and demon hosts rained hellfire on the ranks of the Grey Knights from afar, joined by the Dark Mechanicum Scutari, the children of woe fought their first and last battle. A formless mass of flesh dotted with thousands of weeping eyes devoured Grey Knights with half a dozen Moors, smashing at others with a great power maul held in deceptively thin tentacles, until it was burned to ash by combi flamers and psychic fire, a terrible, mournful cry echoing over the sound of its warped flesh burning away into nothing. Inquisitor Sylviana, who had survived Asim's attack on the Conclave, the subsequent collapse of Inquisitorial headquarters in the sector, and the crossing of the path to nightmares, saw her metal body rust before her augmetic eyes under the touch of a skeletally thin pale giant covered in a black shroud before it ripped out her brain case and crushed it. Seconds later, Inquisitor Alphon cut its head off, fuming with grief-fueled anger at his failure to rescue his colleague in time. At the same time, another group of Grey Knights struggled against an elongated, 8-legged horror with leathery wings, a circular maw full of pointed teeth, and one single, perfect arm holding up a great shard of the broken mirror of Shoxtharx, which Mercurian had forged into a blade and affixed upon a pommel. Despite its apparent fragility, the shard blade sliced right through the knight's armor, and the hungry maw swallowed the pieces of its victims without care for the vengeful cries of their brothers. Eventually, it was brought low, and while the beast writhed under the blades of several nemesis spears, one of the chapter's librarians smote it with a pillar of eldritch lightning infused with the potency of the Emperor's gift. 6 pairs of arms with too many joints extended from the bloated torso of another child of woe, holding a trio of great swords in grips no sane master-at-arms would ever have approved of. The skin of that child of woe was covered in pale scales, and its purple eyes were filled with a mix of maddened horror and the vicious joy of the demon lord riding the body. The blades cut through ceramite armor like axes chopping through wood, and the child's unholy agility let it slither around the bolt of fire aimed at it by the Grey Knights. Then Janus reached it, and it died. The Supreme Grand Master towered over the other Grey Knights, taller even than their Terminators. He wielded the Titan's word one-handed, holding in the other a tower shield covered with holy symbols, which he slammed into the face of the white-scaled child of woe. It recoiled, screaming in pain as the seraphic power of the shield burned at the infernal essence of the demon lord. Before it could recover, Janus attacked, The Titan's word passing between the blades the child had raised to defend itself, severing its neck in one stroke. Another monstrosity had taken advantage of the few heartbeats it had taken Janus to kill its kindred to flank the Supreme Grand Master. Metallic tumors festered under its skin, and it looked like it had once possessed two heads which had been melted into a single unholy sight. Alone of its kind, it carried no weapon, for it was simply unable to carry the tools of war crafted for them by Mercurian, but that hardly made it defenseless. It lashed out at Janus with its 9-fingered claws, tearing deep gouges in the Supreme Grand Master's right shoulder pauldron. The Chapter Master stumbled, thrown off balance by the sheer strength of the blow. But before the Child of Woe could capitalize on that advantage, another Grey Knight, whose armor was far more ornate than that of his brothers and whose psychic power was second only to Janus' own, slammed into its side, bringing it down. Koios, Grand Master of the Second Brotherhood of the Grey Knights, ignited his blade deep inside the flesh of the last of the abominable Primarch replicae the Forsaken Sons had deployed against the Emperor's servants. The creature howled with its twinned mouth as the demon lord possessing it struggled to endure, until it could no longer sustain its physical form and died. Koios briefly wondered where the Forsaken Sons had found so many of the Warp's greatest monsters, and whether they had had any hesitation before creating the monstrosities they had unleashed this day. In the end, it hardly mattered, and they had more pressing concerns to attend to. Over 40 of Koios' battle brothers had already fallen. Not since the Black Crusade of Abaddon had the chapter suffered such losses as they had in this war, and yet the consequences of inaction would have been infinitely worse. Koios had shared the prognosticator's visions of the Nightmare Fleet unleashed. He had seen the traitor Archon raised up by the ruinous powers as an incarnated god, directing the demon ships and abominable intelligences of the Ryaway Noah against the Imperium. He had seen the entire segmentum burn, the Imperium crippled almost beyond recovery, the 1,000 years of darkness that followed, and which might all too easily end in the total collapse of the Imperium and the extinction of the galaxy's last hope. That horrific future may yet come to pass, he knew. Victory against chaos was never certain. But he, and every Grey Knight, every Imperial aboard the Anchor of Vul, would give their lives before this happened. With the last of their great monsters slain, the traitors unleashed their lesser abominations upon the host of the Ordosh. Demon hosts flew, ran and crawled, while rank after rank of dark Mechanicum cyborgs charged. The sorcerers cowardly hid behind their slaves, throwing spells at the Grey Knights, forcing the Sons of Titan to cut through the chaff to reach the heretics and bring them to justice for their sins. Koios fought at Janus' side, the two of them ripping through the Scutari. Repugnant energies dwelled within the cyborgs in vile mockery of the motive force their loyalist counterparts held sacred. Somehow, they were using the warp itself as a source of energy. It didn't help them. If anything, it made them even more vulnerable to the nemesis blades of the Grey Knights. The Grey Knights didn't fight alone, though they did most of the damage. Protected by his retinue of stormtroopers, Elydio Zuckerman was confronting a trio of demon hosts, castigating them with words of power that made the wards on Koios' armor vibrate in sympathetic echoes. One by one, even as the stormtroopers died in agony to hold them back from their lord, the abominations turned to ash, their bindings undone and the infernal spirits possessing the corpses of the unfortunate wretches the Forsaken Sons had sacrificed banished back to the warp. Like most Grey Knights, Koios had his misgivings about the Inquisitor Lord. The files of the Ordo Malleus to which he had access depicted him as edging dangerously close to radicalism, and the fact he had risen to leadership of the Azeroth Conclave on the corpses of his dissenters wasn't exactly reassuring. However, the Supreme Grand Master had told them Elydio Zuckerman was a faithful servant of the Emperor, at least for now. Perhaps, if he survived the Black Crusade, the man might yet succumb to the temptations of the darkness in which he chose to thread to best fight the archenemy, but he hadn't done so yet. And then, of course, there was Inquisitor Ralphon, who had managed to kill one of the Primarch replicae in a single blow. There was something about the unimpressive-looking Inquisitor that made Koios, not worried, but definitely wary. The presence of two such figures might seem strange, but for one thing, they were Inquisitors, and the heirs of the Sigillite were all incredible individuals in the first place. They needed to be in order to survive even a single decade of doing the Emperor's work, regardless of their specialization. And for another, natural selection had most brutally reduced the ranks of the Azeroth Conclave, so it should be expected only the truly exceptional had survived. Or perhaps it was the hand of the Emperor at work. For all that Koios remembered the ideals of the Great Crusade he had once fought in and hadn't embraced the blind zealotry that was spreading ever further through the Imperium's foundations, the Grand Master knew that the Master of Mankind was still active in the galaxy from his entombment on the Golden Throne. As more demon hosts and corrupt Skitarii were cut down, the sorcerers began to summon reinforcements. Demons of Khorne and Sionch rose from the corpses that hadn't been burned or emerged from tears in reality cut open by ritual blades, and threw themselves on the Grey Knights. Koios would have expected the Anchor's defenses to prevent this, but then he realized that the blood of the slain Primarch Replicae must have defiled the chamber to such a degree the minions of the ruinous powers could now enter the great construction of their ancient enemies. Killing demons, however, was the very purpose of the Grey Knights' existence. If the sorcerers thought to overwhelm them with a tide of never-born and warp-infested cyborgs, then they were fools. Unfortunately, the Black Crusade so far had proven that the Forsaken Sons most definitely weren't fools, unlike so many other Astartes who had lost their path and sworn themselves to chaos. Even as he fought with merciless skill, Koios perceived the flow of the wider battle through senses honed by centuries of warfare. Bar some terrible calamity, which he doubted the traitors were holding in reserve, seeing how they had been throwing everything they had at the allied forces since the beginning of this battle, their victory here was assured, though it would not come without a price in irreplaceable Grey Knights. But it would take time that they didn't have, for it was for time the Forsaken Sons fought now. They might slay every abomination and their sorceress masters, only to be too late to stop Harkon from unleashing the Nightmare Fleet. Obviously, this hadn't escaped Janus' attention either. Plus Koios, plus came the silent voice of his lord. Plus I cannot linger here. The works of our foe draw near completion. Plus we'll deal with these heretics then, Lord Janus. Go. Do what you must. Plus. The Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights called his retinue about him, 12 warriors clad in Terminator warplate, each a champion of 1,000 battles against the archenemy. Psychic power gathered around Janus, near blinding to Koios' second sight, forcing their attackers to step back as a convenient side effect. The Grand Masters of the Grey Knights were stronger than their brothers, having received the Emperor's gift from the Master of Mankind himself, but Janus was one step beyond even that. Koios didn't know the true origins of the Supreme Grand Master, but he had his suspicions, even if he had never voiced them, nor would ever do so lest his words be heard by the powers his chapter had been created to oppose. With a swipe of the Titan's word, Janus cut through reality. The ether erupted with the pain screams of demons as the domain they claimed as theirs was penetrated by the holy light of him on earth, and the screams redoubled as Janus and his retinue strode into the opening, passing through the Empyrean to emerge higher up the Anchor, closer to the arch-heretic whose madness threatened to drown the Segmentum in a tide of antediluvian horrors. Then the rift closed, and the screams grew quieter. Of Janus and his warriors, there was no sign. Asim cursed under his breath as his sight returned, letting out a string of Tizcan profanities that would have impressed a space wolf, if the barbarians had ever bothered to learn the language of the people they had all but exterminated on Horus' behalf. Janus had fled, somehow managing to use teleportation here of all places. If the Sorcerer of Blood or his peers had tried it, they would have been destroyed by the backlash from the Anchor's dimensional anomalies, but somehow he didn't doubt for a moment the Supreme Grand Master had managed to arrive precisely where he intended to. This, he thought with an unexpected surge of rancid hatred, was the face of the enemy. It was the will of the false emperor stamped upon the universe, stifling all opposition to his rule until only he remained as sole corpse monarch of a sterile cosmos, populated only by the wretches who sang his praises unto eternity. All the horrors of the realms of chaos paled in comparison to such an accursed state, for at least within chaos was the potential for change, for rebirth and renewal. The Grey Knights called the Forsaken Sons and their kind monsters, but they didn't know the meaning of the word. They were, after all, nothing but mind-wiped children, their bodies transformed by gene craft, their souls filled with eldritch power so that they could be turned into living weapons, little more than automata dancing to the lingering echoes of a tune whose singer had long since fallen silent. They had no will of their own, and yet they thought to decide the fate of the galaxy, blindly following the dogma that had been forced inside their skulls. Really, it was a mercy to kill them. Freeing them from their mind shackles and illuminating them to the true of the universe would have been better, But Archon had been very clear that even attempting such was beyond foolish. The Awakened One had set all of his power to bend fate to his will here, in the Anchor of Vul, yet even he didn't think they stood a chance of actually turning a Knight of Titan. No, killing them would have to suffice. It certainly already was difficult enough, even with their leader having left. The remaining Grey Knights were still fighting like devils. They had been winning this fight before Janus' departure, and the Supreme Grand Master's absence wasn't going to be enough to turn the tides. But now that the forces of destiny drawing Archon and Janus toward their inevitable confrontation no longer had any reason to interfere, Asim had options that had gone from suicidal to merely extremely dangerous. After checking his protections were still up, the Sorcerer of Blood briefly cast his mind into the roiling depths of the Empyrean, and spoke the words that signified his agreement to one of the several pacts he had prepared but not agreed to before the battle had begun. In truth, the bargain was a hasty, half-formed thing. But it would still function. If he killed the Grey Knight Grand Master, the Dark Gods would reward him with the power needed to kill every Grey Knight in this room. It would also most likely destroy him in the process, and the odds he would be able to find a way to return to life after that were slim, though not non-existent. But right now, with the fires of his hate stoked by the ghost of Carthago and the whispers of the Herald of Blood, Asim was willing to make that sacrifice. Grand Master, he shouted, using a trickle of power to make sure his voice was heard over the din of battle. As he spoke, he advanced through the battle, the Skitarian demon hosts parting to let him pass. Would you like to know how Chiron died? After severing the head of another Skitari, the Grey Knight officer turned toward Asim. One of the mortals, the one Asim had faced on Chemairos, and whose tricks had sent him and Carthago back to the Hand of Ruin, recognized the Sorcerer of Blood. This one was there when the Conclave was attacked, called out the Inquisitor. Indeed I was, replied Asim with a mocking bow, not taking his gaze off the Grey Knight. I am Asim, chosen of Archon. And the Inquisitors at Chemairos died as piteously as Chiron. I was there when he came to stop us. I saw him burn in the fires lit by the sins of empire, and I heard the last screams of his soul as it fell into the waiting jaws of the Dark Gods. He died, and the imprisoned escaped its cage beneath Chemairos. I wonder how many worlds will burn as a result. How many loyal, faithful, obedient Imperial lives will be lost, because the Grey Knights failed. The Grey Knight didn't shake in rage at the provocation, not that Asim had expected him to. The silver-clad killers were entirely too dull for such emotional displays. But the taunt did get the Grand Master's attention, and that was all Asim needed. I am Koios, said the swordsman, and I will be your end, traitor. Koios was not without anger. He and Chiron had not been especially close. He had been busy in the Baal system when the former Night Lord had been recruited by the Sigillite, and their duties on Titan had left little time for fraternization. But the other Grand Master had been his brother nonetheless, and he had felt the echoes of his death through the Empyrean as the Fire of Dawn sailed at full speed to join the Imperial flotilla at Neril. He had thought that avenging Chiron would have to wait until the end of the Black Crusade, when Archon had been slain and his plans for the Anchor thwarted, but it seemed fate had given him the chance to do so sooner. A cold anger burned within him. Far from diminishing his concentration, it sharpened it, and Koios used it to stoke the fires of his power as he fought the Chosen of Archon. Sword met staff, and both weapons flared with psychic power as well as the meeting of their energy fields. Many of the sons of Magnus Koios had met had been merely competent with their weapons, relying instead upon the psychic powers that would lead them to damnation. Asim, however, had clearly mastered the martial side of his weapon as well as its psychic one. As their minds grappled with each other, their weapons continued to clash, neither of them giving one step back. And still Asim talked, venting the venom that had accumulated in his soul over the centuries of his service to the ruinous powers. According to the Grey Knight's intelligence, the Forsaken Sons had spent most of the time since the heresy inside the Wailing Storm. They were rumored to be the ones who had unleashed it upon the lost Trebadius sector in the first place. And in all that time, Koios doubted they had met many loyal servants of the Golden Throne, as even a most devout and strong-hearted mortal couldn't survive and stay sane for long in a warp storm. You will fail too, snarled the Sorcerer Lord in a voice that wasn't entirely his own. Koios could see shapes in his aura, presences that clung to his withered soul, whispering hateful words through his lips. Again and again, here or somewhere else, it doesn't even matter. You will fail and keep failing, every failure and every victory costing more and more of the lives you were supposed to protect, and the Imperium will slide down into darkness until it finally, mercifully dies. Never, replied Koios, before letting go of his power sword with his left hand and punching the traitor in the face. As Asim's head was thrown backward, Koios moved his feet, maglocked his boots to the mirrored floor, returned to a two-handed grip, and focused his will on the edge of his blade, before making one brutal motion, putting all of his armor-enhanced transhuman strength in the blow. The power sword cut through the staff with the sound of thunder, and the resulting detonation hurled the sorcerer lord in the air. Asim crashed on the ground, which was still completely untouched despite the violence unleashed within the chamber, a testament to the toughness of whatever material it was the ancient elders had built it from. The sorcerer of blood stared at the Grand Master, wounded and bleeding, his staff broken and his power spent. Yet diminished as the sorcerer lord was, Koios could still feel the embers of great might within his foe, waiting to ignite again in a blaze that would damn stars. The Imperium will stand forevermore, declared Koios as he advanced on the downed heretic. And your kind shall be wiped out, the memory of you consigned to oblivion just as your souls are consigned to the warp's deepest pit. Koios raised his blade, preparing to deliver the final blow that would sever the thread of menace Asim represented. Before he could strike, however, his retinal display was suddenly filled with static, and his ears echoed with 1,000 screams. Amidst the storm of white pixels and noise, he saw a small figure standing between him and Asim, surrounded by a corona of fire and glaring at him with alien eyes overflowing with hate. The Imperium will burn. He blinked. Just like that, the image was gone, the screams silent, and his vision had returned to normal. But by that point Asim had gotten back to his feet. The heretic laughed, then turned and ran out of the chamber. Koios cursed under his breath at the sorcerer lord's cowardice. The other sorcerers were also fleeing, scattering across the immense mirrored chamber, of which the battle only occupied a tiny fraction. They were running toward the corridors leading out of the room, abandoning their allies to die at the blades of the Grey Knights. The remaining demon hosts cried out in outrage, and a few of the cyborg's elites appeared similarly dismayed, but none retreated, compelled as they were to fight to the death. Koios didn't doubt for an instant that there were plenty of traps and ambushes waiting, defensive positions prepared in what little time the traitors had before the arrival of their foes. And of course, there were the rest of the traitor marines who must be waiting elsewhere in the anchor, ready to bleed all those who opposed their Dark Master's mad plan. It would not save them. The Grand Master turned his focus on the battle still raging, his mind rejoining the communion of the warriors of Titan. First, they would purge the demon hosts and Dark Mechanicum Scutari, then, they would resume their advance to the top of the anchor. Koios' own precognitive powers were but a shadow of Lord Janus, but he had enough of the gift to know that the path forward was the same one Asim had fled through. The threads of fate were converging as the Black Crusade reached its apex, pulling the actors of this whole sordid drama together. He could feel the gaze of the dark gods pressing on them all, watching from the warp in rapturous anticipation. They would be disappointed by the ending, this Koios swore. The Anchor of Vul. 745.M32. Death to the False Emperor. With the ancient war cry on his lips, Malone plunged through a squad of guardsmen in stained fatigues. His sword cut through their flak armor like paper while his relic las pistol punched through the armor of the closest heir of Sanguinius, sending the warrior crashing through the ground with a fist-sized hole in his chest. Igdal fought alongside him, tearing through the loyalist guardsman with his power sword and his bolt pistol. So did Marcus the Riven, though the mortal champion of chaos was likely unique in the entire Battle of the Anchor in that he fought barehanded, as he always had so long as Malone had known him. As always, he wore no armor but a simple robe of scarlet cloth, trusting in his reflexes, skills and the gifts of the dark gods to keep him unharmed, and so far, despite the caliber of the opposition they faced, it had been enough, though the Riven was careful not to engage the heirs of Sanguinius. His hands were red with the blood of his victims as he plunged them into the chest of an Imperial, tearing out his heart before kicking another in the neck, breaking his spine in a single blow, all while twisting his own torso out of the way of their panicked las fire. Behind the pack's 3 melee fighters, a squad of 12 troopers from Androka's Prime led by Lieutenant Lizondarati unleashed volleys of las fire, their weapons set at maximum power to ensure every hit was a kill. All around them, the endless corridors of the Anchor of Vol echoed with the sounds of battle, as packs of Forsaken Sons fought the Imperial and Eldar forces who had made it this far into the megastructure. Vox communication beyond line of sight range was impossible, the unimaginable energies coursing through the Anchor fouled the signals. And the closest to the singularity atop the Anchor one went, the tighter and more maze-like its insides became. This, however, worked to the Forsaken Sons' advantage. Having managed to push through the hosts of entropy and illusion, the forces of order were caught in 100 ambushes. Survivors of both defeated armies had fled into the vast corridors of the Anchor, and the Nurglite and etheric mutants seized the smallest opportunity to avenge their defeat. The greatest threat to the allied but separated Eldar and Imperial armies, however, were the Forsaken Sons themselves. The Chaos Marines were raw veterans of centuries of warfare, capable of fighting in small groups much more efficiently than either of the armies who had invaded the Anchor on their heels. At Archon's orders, the Warband's packs had scattered through the higher levels of the Anchor, fighting to make the enemies pay in blood for every kilometer and slow their advance, buying with their lives the time the Awakened One needed to complete his great work. Across the continent-sized megastructure, handfuls of Forsaken Sons emerged from hiding, firing a few volleys and slaughtering a handful of troops before retreating, which was exactly what Mahone's pack were doing here. The Unbound Lord rammed his blade through the throat of an air of sanguineous sergeant while kicking in the ribcage of an Imperial guardsman trying to flank him. The mortal flew backward, and the primed grenade he had been holding detonated in the middle of the rest of his squad. 6 of the mortals died, but the rest charged him, despite being covered in the gory remains of their comrades. Shouts of alarm and fury rose from the throats of hundreds of nearby guardsmen, and the turrets of tanks swung in the direction of Mahone's strike force. It was time to move, before the Imperials could react and crush them with overwhelming numbers. The Chosen of Archon barked an order, and the strike force turned back, vanishing into the corridor from which they had emerged, Mahone leading them through the maze. The sounds of pursuit quickly faded. The Imperials couldn't break off from the main host, not without surrendering all hope of victory. The Imperials had been driven beyond fear by the horrors of the Nurglite host, and would not break easily. There was nowhere to run for them in any case. The transports who had brought them aboard the Anchor had left the landing bay, and the Unbound Lord doubted they would return until the battle was over one way or another. The Imperial commanders were fully aware of the importance of this battle. They wouldn't allow their forces to withdraw. Malone had seen more than one guardsman be executed by their own commissars as they attempted to flee from the Unbound Lord and his allies, the stern voice of the red-sashed officers reminding their troops of the fate earned by cowardice. The Forsaken Sons couldn't escape either. Of course, the Hand of Ruin had been destroyed, along with most of their fleet. The Blade of Terror still endured. Morkoth had managed to get a brief message to Malone using the demon ship's infernal transmitter, and so did the Eidolon of Regret, but neither vessel would get close to the Anchor of Vol, not when the Allied fleet was so close. And while the Eidolon had unloaded a considerable quantity of ammunition crates and other supplies which were now scattered across the Anchor to support the Forsaken Sons' guerrilla efforts, bringing in a teleportarium that worked inside the megastructure had been too much to ask. Both sides having their back against the wall made for bloody fighting, corridor by corridor, immense room by impossible hall. The closer to the top of the megastructure you got, the more the Anchor made a mockery of conventional three-dimensional space, with corridors looping in on themselves or angles not adding up as they should. But Malone had found he instinctively understood the broken geometry of this place far better than their auspexes did. Something in the way his brain had been altered on his homeworld, and further refined during his ascension, made him uniquely suited to this particular battlefield. He could grasp the patterns beneath the apparent randomness, knowing where to go to exit a corridor and enter one of the alien rooms of unknowable purpose, or which path to take to emerge behind an enemy force despite always seeming to move away from them. He would have thanked Jacaerys, hadn't the old Fleshmaster got what he deserved at Igdal's hands on Beranos. He paused. Something was wrong. It took him several seconds to realize that there was another echo of ceramite boots slamming into the floor. Anastates was coming, running fast through the corridors. Ambush pattern, he commanded, gesturing for his pack to take cover behind a pair of square pillars that, while translucent, were full of some orange liquid that would block them from view. It was unlikely that an heir of Sanguinius would break off to move on his own, but maybe they had gotten lost. Malone frowned as the source of the echoes came into view. Arsim? Ah, Malone, replied the Sorcerer of Blood, sounding pained and out of breath. His armor bore signs of battle, and he was missing his staff. "I am glad to have found you. Prepare yourself. By my best estimate, we have about 70 seconds before one of the Grey Knight's commanders and his friends join us." Behind him, Malone heard Digdal curse violently. He was tempted to join him. Janus and his 12 warriors came back to reality in front of a band of monsters armored in black and gold. Chaos Marines, Terminators and 4 demon engines in the shape of monstrous beasts. Calastalal, he heard the name whispered by the warp, stood guard in front of an archway hundreds of meters high, behind which extended a stairway made of shadow and light. None of them were without wound, their armor and flesh, where there was still a distinction between the two, damaged in the fight to reach this point. A veritable carpet of broken constructs surrounded them, with still more crawling over the corpses of their brethren to hurl themselves at the invaders. The Chaos Marines were caught by surprise by the Grey Knight's teleportation, but these were veterans of the Long War, and they recovered quickly. A hail of gunfire enveloped the Grey Knights, while Janus' helm display filled with target lock. In the corner of his vision, the chrono display glitched before stabilizing as the quantic-based mechanisms of his armor reasserted themselves, and Janus silently cursed. The trip through the warp had felt instantaneous, yet they had lost almost half an hour nonetheless. It was a fraction of the time they would have spent walking through the anchor to reach this point, but that the delay had existed it all spoke of the degree of attention Arkan's mad plan had drawn from the ruinous powers. Time was running out, the Supreme Grand Master could feel it in his soul. They couldn't afford to dither, to choose the tactics best suited to the destruction of the foe in front of them. Not when that foe was only a distraction, one more obstacle their true enemy had thrown in their way to slow them down. And so, with a telepathic pulse of command, Janus and his brothers charged the enemy, a direct and simple onslaught, with storm bolters opening fire as they advanced, their speed increasing as they gained momentum. There was no cover to hide behind for any of them, and the Forsaken Sons focused their fire, those not in Terminator armor covering behind the hulking forms of their brethren or the Calastalal. Yet even as they did so, the silvery constructs surged again, emerging from impossibly perfect holes in the walls that Janus was certain hadn't been there when they had arrived. "Plus do not open fire on the constructs, plus ordered Janus. The Grey Knights were outnumbered 4 to 1, and these were the elite of the Forsaken Sons. They would need all the help they could get, even if it was of Xeno's origin." The Grey Knights slammed into the line of Chaos Terminators and Demon Engines, and one of the Chaos Terminators moved to confront Janus. He was taller than the rest, and Janus could see how, like the others, his flesh had been fused to his armor, only to be then stretched out by the blessings of his dark patrons, his body reshaped to match his authority over them. "I am Damarian," he began, first of Arkan's champions. "You shall not." Janus struck before the heretic could finish, having no interest in the words of yet another traitor to the Golden Throne. The Titan's words sneaked past the Terminator's guard and plunged into his throat, cutting right through the weaker armor of his gorget. With a twist of his wrist, he severed the head of the traitor, sending it flying. The armored corpse remained standing, locked in place by the final impulses from the brain of its master, and Janus pushed it aside with a telekina blast, sending it crashing into another traitor. The Forsaken Sons roared in fury at the sight of their leader's death, redoubling their assault on the Grey Knights. 5 more veterans of the Siege of Terra fell beneath Janus' blade, as did a demon engine that looked like a cross between a lion and a scorpion, until finally, the path was clear. "Plus hold here, plus," he ordered his warriors. "Plus let none pass. Plus fight well, Lord Janus, plus," replied Percival, who had fought at Janus' side since he had finished his training in the halls of Titan, under the tutelage of Malcador's Chosen. "Plus and you too, Percival. Know that I have always been proud to call you all my brothers." Leaving his warriors behind to hold the archway, Janus rushed up the eldritch stairs. They bore his weight without issue, his armor's sensors failing to pick up the slightest vibration as his boots slammed into them, the kinetic energy swallowed by their arcane construction. The Supreme Grand Master moved as fast as his transhuman physiology and master-wrought suit of armor would allow him. He climbed steps meant for Dari limbs 5 at a time, his mind focused on what awaited. Even as he did so, a part of him still took in the grandeur of his surroundings. He couldn't see the end of the space around him, his surroundings filled with a white radiance even his armor's auto-senses couldn't penetrate. The stairs were all he could see, stretching out in a spiral upward. As he climbed, he finally glimpsed his destination, a circular platform of the same black material as the outside of the anchor of wool, seemingly floating in the air without anything supporting it. A sphere of colorless light floated in front of the platform, shining far brighter than the white radiance suffusing this strange realm. It was difficult to gauge its dimensions against the backdrop of brilliant light, but Janus guessed it to be at least the size of an Imperator Titan. His armor's sensors, which had been struggling to cope with the readings they were getting since he had entered the anchor, finally gave up, filling his display with alarms and errors that forced him to shut down his auto-senses and removed his helmet with his free hand, letting him look upon the scene with his own eyes. 3 figures already stood on the platform, clustered at its center. 2 were clearly members of the Dark Mechanicum. One was little more than a grotesque mass of mechadendrites emerging from a hooded robe and ending in wicked, mutated weaponry. The other was a demon-faced monstrosity whose soul fire burned in Janus' second sight with the fell light of unholy knowledge. This, the Grey Knight immediately recognized, was an arch-heretic, a master of the law the Emperor in his wisdom had forbidden all to delve into. It was bent over a waist-high pillar, 8 tendrils of flesh and metal extending from its back and manipulating what Janus deduced must be the controls for the entire megastructure. And then, of course, there was Archon, facing Janus with his back to the sphere of energy, a dark shape that seemed as if it would eclipse the white light. The Chaos Lord was as Janus remembered him from their brief confrontation in the Sea of Souls. Whatever his sins, which were as numerous as they were unforgivable, the Awakened One clearly held no delusions about himself that could have warped his aspect on the psychic plane. Janus didn't waste time on words. The moment his feet reached the platform, he hurled himself at the trio of heretics. The mass of mechadendrites, showing either remarkable courage or the true extent of its obedience protocols, threw itself in his path. With a few swipes of the Titan's word, Janus reduced it to pieces bleeding blood and oil, having barely slowed down his stride. Archon was already reacting, however, leaving the demon-masked arch-heretic and running toward the sphere of energy at the opposite edge of the platform. Janus charged straight for the Chaos Lord, smashing the arch-heretic as he passed it by. This close to the singularity, he didn't dare to use his psychic powers, but his physical strength, augmented as it was by his master-wrought armor, was more than enough to pry it off the command pillar and send it flying off the edge of the platform. It fell down the depthless abyss, screeching and demonic-tainted. Too late, Janus said the Awakened One, smiling, and plunged his right arm into the sphere of energy. The anchor couldn't feel pain. It would have been nonsensical for its makers to give it the ability to do so. But it could sense the intrusion into its systems, the violation of its protocols. Most of all, it could sense the unraveling of its purpose. It couldn't scream. It couldn't express what it felt, for to do so would have endangered its purpose even further. All it could do was try everything it could do to stop what was happening, to hold its purpose from being completely ruined. It rebuilt broken walls even as they collapsed from the terrible blow they had suffered, calculating which of the entities caught within could be released with the least damage to its purpose. The dimensional barriers stabilized, even as an entire group of captives were released. However, the anchor knew that another such blow, and the cage would fall apart completely. Irithiel was leading his forces between cascades of flowing stone when he felt it. As an autarch, his psychic abilities were stunted, barely enough of his potential allowed to manifest for him to interface with the more esoteric components of his equipment. Yet even with these limitations, he was still an elder, with his soul far more attuned to the currents of the ether than those of most humans. The discordance hit him like a hammer to the skull, and as he shook his head to clear his vision, he saw that many of his warriors were similarly affected, no few of them having fallen to the ground. Grimacing through the pain, he shouted commands, re-establishing order and battle lines before the enemy could take advantage of their weakness. Only once this was done did Irithiel spare any thought for the cause of the disruption. It had been so sudden, so brutal, that he hadn't been able to make any sense of it. He considered calling Elethria. The Farseer was close by, acting as leader to the warlock conclaves who were attached to the Minotaur warriors. But her sight was completely blocked by the anchor and the powers warring for control of it, and besides, he doubted she was in any state to answer his questions. As a Farseer, she would have been affected much worse than him. Instead, he raised the bridge of the promise of Lilith. "Report," he ordered. "What in Aisha's name just happened?" "Lord Autarch," The voice of the bridge officer was a mix of relief at hearing her commander's voice and shock. "We are seeing strange fluctuations in the energy levels of the anchor of Vul, and space-time anomalies are multiplying in the system. The cage of the Ryaway Noah is straining." Irithiel's blood turned to ice in his veins. Were they too late? "New contacts are slipping in and out of the dimensional oubliette," continued the officer, seemingly confirming the Autarch's worst fears. Her next words, however, filled him with hope. "We are getting readings, by the stars, Autarch. Those are Eldari ships." Time didn't move, until it did. Exultant Fleetmaster Oberkiel of the Great House Finley, 17th Prince of the Abalyas territories, blinked in surprise as he realized this. Like every Eldari of the Armada mustered to draw the Ryaway Noah into the cage the Smiths of Vul had constructed, he had fully expected for his existence to end forever as the jaws of the trap closed in on both his fleet and the Monkeys' mad creations. Oh, their allies had sworn they would look for a way to free the fleet without unleashing the Ryaway Noah, but neither Oberkiel nor any sailor under his command had expected it to work. The Empire was falling apart. In the old days, the Ryaway Noah would never have been allowed to become such a threat. But the old days were long gone, and it was a miracle the Smiths had even been able to build the anchor in the first place. Oberkiel couldn't speak for his crew, but he at least had volunteered for this duty, at least partially because it meant he wouldn't have to witness any more of the depravity of the other so-called great houses. Sacrificing his life to seal an abomination like the Ryaway Noah was as honorable an ending as could be hoped for, and the nature of that ending would also spare his spirit from returning to the wheel of rebirth. Once, that prospect might have horrified him, but with what was taking place on the other side of the veil, he had actually found it reassuring. Yet now, however impossible it may seem, he had been freed, and the duties and oaths he had thought were ended resumed their hold over him. First, he needed to know how this liberation had come about. With his mind merged to his ship, the Eternal Vow, Oberkiel looked at their surroundings. His fleet was there, though several ships were missing that had been there when the anchor had activated. There was no sign of the Ryaway Noah's nightmare ships, praise Assyrian's mercy. The anchor of Vul was still there, with some slight drift from its original position. There were other vessels retreating from it, some resembled Eldari civilian ships, but the others reminded the exultant fleetmaster of the Monkeys' brutish designs. He frowned, and reached out to the rest of his fleet, the order to pursue and destroy these interlopers from the lesser races already on his lips. Something was wrong. Oberkiel couldn't feel the extensive psychic network of the Empire anymore. Instead, he felt. What in Assyrian's holy name is that? "Hello, Oberkiel," purred an awful voice. "I have been waiting for you." There was a presence there, infesting the place where the Empire had been. It was immense. It was malice incarnate. It was sickeningly familiar and revoltingly attractive. He was terrified of it, yet he had never desired anything more in his entire, eon-spanning life. A name rose from the depths of Oberkiel's soul, where dwelled the darkness he had tried to deny by dedicating himself to the service of a decadent empire. He refused to give it voice, but it boomed into his soul, and across his fleet thousands of Eldari were not so resilient and screamed it as one. Slunch. The name burned Oberkiel's soul, made him want to puke and laugh and weep at the same time. He felt his skin burn, felt his eyes bulge inside his skull, his every sensation amplified 100-fold. "Assyrian," he prayed, "save. Assyrian is dead, Oberkiel. They are all dead. There is only me. And you and all your kind are mine." The Eldar and Imperial ship masters watched in horror as thousands of Eldari, a fraction of what the Imperium would have needed to crew an equivalent fleet, thanks to the wonders of Eldari technology, were devoured by slunch in a single breath. The Prince of Excess moaned in delight, savoring a delicacy it had been denied for millennia. The great ships of their fleet, each a marvel of engineering that combined long-lost technologies with the tremendous psychic power of the ancients, cracked open and were turned to slag as warp rifts opened inside them by the hundreds. The soulless husks of the Eldari fell down and melted, new demons of sludge spawned from their final moments of uncomprehending horror rising in their place. Gaping maws opened where gun emplacements had stood. Solar sails became blades that cut the void and left it bleeding in their wake. Unblinking eyes opened in the place of crystal observation domes, staring at the galaxy with pupils shaped like slunch's unholy sigil. The newly born demon ships began to advance toward the fleets of order. Driven solely by unholy hungers, There was no formation or plan of attack, but the numbers and demonic might of the corrupted Eldari vessels left no doubt as to how a confrontation would end. Within moments, the Imperial and Eldar fleets disengaged from their positions around the Anchor of Vul, and fled into the void with the demon ships in hot pursuit. The Myantar elders felt the horrific fate of their forebears echo through their souls. Many screamed in shared agony and overwhelming terror, leaving them crippled and vulnerable. The Forsaken Sons redoubled their ambushes, slaying hundreds of the Eldar warriors. And on his helm's display, Autarch Irithialat saw the doom of the ancestors he had thought might return his people to glory, and tasted the ashes of his dream on his tongue. The Anchor of Vul screamed. It was the only way Janus could put it. Arcs of black lightning danced across the surface of the energy sphere from where Arkan's arm penetrated it. Vast spans of nothing flickered in the light around them, openings into dimensions where nothing of this universe could even be dreamt of. And beyond the walls of the Anchor, the Grey Knight sensed the doom of thousands of Eldari souls, consumed by the Dark Prince of Chaos within seconds of their liberation from their millennia-long imprisonment. Despite the immense psychic pressure, Janus hadn't stopped moving. The weight was almost unbearable, but he forced himself to keep running. Arkan hadn't won yet. The corrupt Eldari ships were a threat, yes, but nothing compared to the horrors the Nightmare Fleet would bring about if it were unleashed. Arkan saw him approach, and his eyes widened minutely. Janus saw the calculations behind the awakened one's gaze, and the moment he realized he wouldn't be able to finish breaking the dimensional oubliette fully open in time. With a scowl, the Chaos Lord tore his arm free of the sphere of energy, his claws glinting with severed sunlight. Janus' first blow was parried, the Titan's word held within one of the claws. He ripped the sword free in a shower of sparks. "I was hoping to make you realize you had failed before killing you," said Arkan. "But I see I will have to settle for watching the light go out from your eyes." The Titan's word gave Janus greater reach than Arkan's claws. The Chaos Lord understood this, and sought to move close in to nullify that advantage. As he did so, purple warp fire erupted across his black Terminator armor, leaping from him in the form of hungry maws that bit at the wards on Janus' own warplate. The old Legion files made no mention of Arkan possessing any psychic potential. He had been recruited before the Edict of Nicaea had made the recruitment of new psykers more trouble than it was worth. What was the point of training an aspirant to master his power to avoid killing himself, only for him to be forbidden using that power afterwards? But he had received many gifts from his infernal masters. His soul was a maelstrom of power which couldn't be controlled, only restrained or directed as it poured out of the inferno the dark gods had ignited inside him. Usually, Janus fought in silence. But the amount of self-control Arkan was exerting was prodigious. One slip, and it would destroy him from within. If Janus could manage to get the Chaos Lord to lose his temper, he might win this battle without striking a single blow with the Titan's word. Over 1,000 years of fighting the minions of the ruinous powers had taught him that truth was the most efficient way to get under their skin, and so it was truth he employed. "Your masters have betrayed you," he proclaimed. "Even now, their gifts are killing you." Unexpectedly, Arkan gave a short bark of laughter. "Do you think I don't know this? My life is a more than acceptable price for your death and the release of the Nightmare Fleet. What kind of warrior would I be if I were not willing to give my life for victory? A rare one, to fight under the banner of chaos. And death will be the least of what awaits you." "It doesn't matter," said Arkan, his eyes burning with a different kind of fire than the one lashing out at Janus' armor. "So long as the Imperium burns." And there, thought Janus, was the monstrous tragedy of chaos. Before Horus' betrayal, Arkan had been a faithful servant of the Imperial truth, a great warrior dedicated to the Great Crusade's ideals and the protection of mankind. The dark gods had hollowed him, burning away every admirable quality he had once possessed, leaving only those traits that served their ends. That even this much of his past self remained was testament to Arkan's strength of will, but this too had been bent to the dark god's purpose. It was the same with Abaddon, whether the self-proclaimed War Master realized it or not. The very willpower that made Ezekiel capable of withstanding the ruinous powers' boons without submitting to them was what made him the perfect champion to rally their fractious hosts behind. It was a grotesque paradox, but such was the way of chaos. The Grey Knights had failed to kill Abaddon during his Black Crusade. There had been too many fronts, as the Black Legion that had escaped the Black Templars at Cadia scattered across the segmentum, and 100 demonic plots needed to be put down. By the time Janus had realized where Abaddon had gone, he had already returned to the Eye of Terror, Dracnan in hand. But Arkan wouldn't escape, nor would he succeed. The galaxy couldn't survive another such tyrant. No matter the cost, Janus would see the Awakened One dead. Despite the utter agony that permeated his flesh and his soul, Arkan was exultant as he battled Janus. This was the culmination of his Black Crusade, what all the preparations and sacrifices he had made had led toward. Worlds had burned, armies had been spent, his greatest generals and companions had been sent to draw away the strength of the Grey Knights. It galled him that even now, in spite of all of this, it might yet come to naught if he fell here. He used the anger that thought caused, channeling it to strengthen his will against the unceasing onslaught of warp-born power raging through him. With Alzerak dead and Mercurian lost, he couldn't link with the lamentation aboard the Eidolon of regret. But he didn't care. Right now, all that mattered was killing Janus, everything else was secondary. He could only pursue one objective, trying to accomplish both at the same time would result in him failing at both. The Chaos Lord and the Supreme Grand Master battled on the platform of black metal, surrounded by the tormented light of the Anchor of Vul. They moved back and forth, the air around them crackling with sorcerous energy. They were each masters of their chosen weapons, veterans of centuries of brutal fighting against the horrors of the warp, Janus across the Imperium, Arkan in the Wailing Storm, and they were equally matched. Janus had thought to distract him with unwelcome truths, foolishly believing Arkan was just another blind puppet of the ruinous powers, where the Awakened One had gone into his bargain with open eyes. But that didn't mean the tactic didn't have merit, and Arkan had words for the Supreme Grand Master far more devastating than his own petty revelations. "Let me tell you something, Janus," he began, speaking over the clashing of their blades. "You and your chapter think you need to hide yourself from the gaze of the Dark Gods, believing that knowledge of you will give them an advantage and make you unable to perform the duty the Corpse Emperor entrusted to you. You've done terrible things to preserve your secrets, haven't you? Not taking into account all those you killed whose only sin was glimpsing the truths you've deemed humanity must be kept ignorant from, as if keeping the existence of chaos would somehow make it all go away." The very concept was ridiculous. The false emperor had already tried it during the Great Crusade, and it hadn't worked then either. If anything, ignorance made it easier for the seeds of heresy to take root. The Inquisition seemed to believe that if they killed enough of their own people, they could keep the rest under control, which would work, for a time. Sooner or later, the very cruelty of the Imperium would cause it to fall apart, and on that day, the Dark God's laughter would echo across the galaxy. But that inevitable truth wasn't the chisel Arkan intended to chip at Janus' resolve with. He had another approach in mind, from his discussion with Abaddon aboard the Hand of Ruin, years ago. "And it is all for nothing," he forcefully declared. "The warp already knows everything about you, Janus. We know everything about you. We have known for centuries. Since the first time Abaddon led his Black Legion out of the Eye of Terror and pried off his destiny from the hands of the Dark God's guardians. You sent your brothers to kill his sorcerer, Iskandar Yon, do you remember? And they failed. This you know, but what you didn't know is that, as they laid on the ground before him, broken and bleeding, he ripped out their secrets from their minds. All your rites, all your precious catechisms. The location of your stronghold, Titan, the moon of Saturn. Where your weapons come from, Deimos, stolen from Mars and hidden away. We know about the Augurium, the Chambers of Purity, the Dead Fields and the Hall of Champion. We know about the Gatherers, stealing millions of children and condemning them to death so that 1 in a million might join your ranks. We know about the forbidden tomes of the Librarium Demonica, the Tesseract prisons of the Vault of Labyrinths. We know about Broadsword Station, about your 8 brotherhoods and their specialities. We know. You. All the cities wiped out, all the loyal armies who fought alongside you and remained free of the taint only for you to gun them down, all the Space Marines whose memories you took, depriving them of experience that might make all the difference in later campaigns. It is all for nothing. Now and forever, the Dark Gods laugh at you, for you were the greatest weapon in the anathema's hands, and have managed to forge defeat from even your greatest victories. You, replied Janus in a growl, know nothing. I know enough to know that you have already failed. But fret not, Janus. Your journey is about to end. It was all about symbols, in the end. He had learned that in the wailing storm, listening to the whispers of Serexithar and then those of the gods themselves, without the need for the oracle's intercession. The tides of the warp were shaped by the materium and shaped it in turn, and within the realms of chaos symbolism and metaphors were the same as power. Janus had come to the anchor of Vol as the symbol of the Imperium's dominion, and Archon's words had challenged that dominion's righteousness, which the Imperial Creed wielded like a hammer to crush all thoughts of dissent and rebellion within its ranks. And Janus' response, the accusation of ignorance, was something countless petty tyrants had used as justification for their own atrocities throughout the ages of humanity. It didn't matter that it was true this time, that was the opening he needed to finish this. Or perhaps Archon was just finally going crazy, and attributing meaning to the random shifting of the Empyrean like a child seeing shapes in the clouds or a madman seeing signs of conspiracy in the bloody politics of a hive world. It was certainly possible, and in that case, Archon could very well have doomed his entire warband for nothing. But as long as he killed Janus, Archon didn't care. To Khorne, he began as he and Janus continued to clash, their blades cutting through armor but failing to draw blood. I dedicate the slaughter of the billions who perished across Azarok, and the blood of those who fight beneath us now. To Slash, I return the souls of the Dari who escaped their doom by being trapped alongside the Nightmare Fleet. To Nurgle, I bring the despair of shining souls, as they realize their dreams of empire are but dust, and all that remains is a slow descent into corruption and weakness, until entropy inevitably claims all. And to Zionch, I offer this, the last chance of redemption for Magnus the Red, snuffed out forevermore. The power the dark gods had bestowed upon him swelled with his words, the Pantheon recognizing the worth of his offerings and responding in kind. Here and now, he could kill Janus and deprive the Imperium of one of its most potent weapons in the long war. Fresh armies could be raised, new ships could be built, and even worlds could be replaced. Even 1,000,000 worlds were but a tiny fraction of the galaxy's planets. But no other Supreme Grand Master would ever be Janus' equal. For as his perceptions expanded in time with his might, Archon could see the power within Janus. He could see it changing the warrior beyond the transformation he had already undergone. He could see the awful thing that waited at the end of that path. It would be a mercy, he thought, to spare Janus from that fate. The Titan's word and the chaos-infused claws struck together. The ancient, Emperor-blessed blade cut through shields of warp energy, armor, flesh and bone, severing Archon's right arm at the shoulder. At the same time, the 5 scythe-like blades of his left hand plunged through Janus' chest and burst out of his back with enough strength to briefly lift him off his feet. I win, whispered Archon, before headbutting Janus, breaking his nose and throwing him off his bloodied claws. The Supreme Grand Master landed on his back, blood pouring out of his torso, while the flow of Archon's own vitae was already stopped, the stump of his right arm cauterized by the warp fire coiling across his body. Shifting his posture to account for the change in balance caused by his lost limb, Archon advanced on his downed foe, wary of the sword the Grey Knight still held in his right hand. It was time to finish this, but despite his earlier words, the awakened one was aware this could still end in failure. Janus was much more than another loyalist culled from the legions by Malcador during the heresy. He was, as the Dark Gods had revealed to him, a creation of the Sigillite using the soul shard of the Crimson King the Thousand Suns had joined the Siege of Terror in hope of reclaiming, not knowing it was already gone. The Silver Soul who blazed with anathema light was wounded and losing. If it perished, the tainted fire it fought against would unmake the purpose entirely. The Anchor couldn't intervene. Its influence within the command room was even lesser than within the rest of itself. But even so, it was not without options. It reached within itself, watching the souls who had come to oppose the enemies of its purpose through senses that had no equivalent in the realm of flesh. Its influence within the control room was limited, but there was one protocol it could use, meant to bring its commander directly into position, just in case the target had found out about its existence and launched a surprise attack. One soul. But who? There were so many, and none of them matched the strength of the one who was dying. In the end, it selected the oldest soul, the one who had lived longest of them all. Among its creators, age had been a measure of strength and skill, and if power wasn't enough perhaps skill would be. It was a gamble, but it was the one path down which it couldn't predict the failure of its purpose with a 100% certainty. It snatched that soul out of the fight it was a part of, and brought it directly in the command chamber, right in front of the console the intruders had torn open. Inquisitor Alphon blinked as the light of alien teleportation faded from his sight. One moment he had been fighting a Forsaken son whose dedication to the Blood God had made him willing to charge the one group in the Anchor who had Grey Knights among it. The next he was here, wherever here was. He looked around, and part of him immediately wished he hadn't. Janus was there, bleeding and on the ground. Arkan was there too, and judging by their surroundings, they were near the top of the Anchor of Vul, in whatever served as its control chamber. Alphon was also standing directly between Janus and Arkan. The Chaos Lord was stunned by his sudden arrival, his gaze wary and darting around, as if he expected more warriors to teleport in. Truth be told, Alphon would have been fine with that. He could certainly use the aid of a Grey Knight or 12 right now. But whatever arcane mechanism had delivered him here, it apparently couldn't or wouldn't bring anyone else. "Who are you?" asked Arkan. "I am Inquisitor Alphon," he replied. "And though I know not how I came here, the why, I believe is obvious to us all." Arkan laughed, the sound dark and rich with mockery. "I suppose so. The Anchor fights to the last, it seems. And what do you think you can accomplish, mortal, where even a son of the Emperor has failed, however mutilated his soul?" Alphon thought back to the words he and Tarak had exchanged in silence aboard Cardinal Station. Tarak had told him back then that the hour was coming where his secrets would be revealed. Had the tormented soul already known how this would unfold? Perhaps, perhaps not. In the end, it mattered not. There was only one course of action open to him. "I am no mere mortal," he declared. "I am Alphon, son of Earth. I bore witness to the Age of Reason, and the sins that led to its collapse in fire and death of such scale as to make your gene sire's petty rebellion pale in comparison. I have seen the true face of the dark gods you serve and spat in their eye. I have been many things, but now and always, I fight to protect humanity from the monsters in the dark." Silence followed his declaration. With every word, Alphon had felt himself grow lighter, as if by casting aside the masks he had hidden behind for so long he had also freed himself from a more physical burden. "Perpetual," the Chaos Lord spat out the ancient, all but forgotten word like a curse. Alphon nodded, more than a bit surprised but letting none of it show on his face. "I see your masters have told you many of the galaxy's secrets, traitor." "I didn't believe that one was real when they told me," admitted the Chaos Lord. "For humans to be gifted immortality, seemingly at random? It beggars belief. And yet, what does it matter? Your kind have long since become irrelevant to the great game. The very Inquisition you serve would burn you at the stake as a heretic if they suspected your nature. The last few of you who haven't been hunted down cower in the shadows of history, knowing full well that the galaxy has left you behind. Do you really think you can interfere with what will happen here this day?" All that Arkan had said was true. In his long life, Alphon had only ever met a handful of his peers, and he had outlived them all. Nothing truly lived forever, and death couldn't be denied indefinitely. Alphon knew, though he couldn't explain how, that his own form of immortality was a limited one. He didn't age, and could heal from even the most grievous wound given enough time, but unlike others, he wouldn't be able to return from death once it finally claimed him. There were gradients in the abilities of the Perpetuals, and Alphon's had always been on the lower end. It was why he had stayed out of the heresy, not joined the fabled Cabal or taken part in any of the galaxy-wide schemes so many of his peers had gotten involved with. Instead, he had focused on helping people, protecting them from the techno-horrors of the cybernetic revolt, then the depredations of the Age of Strife. He had always focused on the small steps, knowing that only at that level did things stay clear-cut. Joining the Inquisition had been a difficult decision, and one that, in the end, had brought him here, where his chances of survival were slim to say the least. "But so what?" "I think," said Alphon, who had once been a soldier of the Great Terran Federation, raising his blade and pistol with a vicious smile on his lips, "that I would very much like to find out." The Anchor of Vul. 745.M32. They couldn't fight a Grand Master of the Grey Knights and his warriors alone. Malone had realized that much immediately. He still remembered how a single squad of Grey Knights had torn through the defenses of the Black Temple on Beranos, and the other chosen had hardly fared any better. Two unbound, an exhausted sorcerer lord, a handful of mortals and whatever you wanted to count Marcus as would hardly fare any better. So instead of standing their ground and fighting against unsurmountable odds like champions out of legend, they had run away, hoping to lose the Grey Knights in the maze, knowing this was supremely unlikely. The anchor seemed to especially want Asim to die. It was the only explanation for how the Grand Master had caught up with him, despite needing to finish the fight against the forces of the Coven before giving chase. The Grey Knights had been guided, their way eased while Asim's was slowed. As they retreated, they rallied several packs of Forsaken Sons to them, the opportunity to kill a Grey Knight commander more than enough to pull them from their own ambushes. For the first time since Beranos, Malone found himself in command of Forsaken Sons veterans, not that he was in a position to enjoy that authority. Eventually, they had to stop running. Despite Malone's guidance, the Grey Knights were still gaining on them, and this section of the anchor was better than most for the Forsaken Sons to face their pursuers in. Four-sided pyramids rose up to meet inverted ones descending from the roof, 200 meters above, with some kind of spherical energy field crackling where they met. The room was filled with 16 such pyramids in a 4x4 grid, each pyramid 200 meters wide at the base. Of course, all these measurements were rough estimates. It wasn't as if the original architects had used human units. The Grey Knights came into view just as they finished settling into their positions. 2 scores of Titan sons, with, to Malone's slight surprise, a few squads of inquisitorial troops still following them, having managed to keep up with the Astartes' pace. Against them, they had around 60 Forsaken Sons, an exhausted sorcerer of blood, and 53 mortal auxiliaries. A volley of heavy weapon fire, plasma rifles, melter guns and missile launchers, slammed into the first rank of Grey Knights. A psychic barrier held most of the onslaught at bay, but not all. Silver armor cracked and blood and gore were spilled upon the black stone. The melee combatants charged down the pyramids, their boots mag-locking with each step to avoid slipping on the utterly smooth surface. Raptors, who had been hanging upside down from the ceiling, dropped down and ignited their jump packs. They flew over the Grey Knights and landed among the stormtroopers, igniting flamers and lightning claws. The sound of screaming soon echoed as the corrupted assault marines tore through the mortal soldiers, though the inquisitorial goons fought back with great skill and discipline. Malone glimpsed their leader, an inquisitor, the only one left in the group, in human-sized power armor, wielding a bolt pistol and a staff. He fought especially well, striking down a warrior who had stood on the walls of the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terror, back when he had worn the colors of the 8th Legion. Warriors in black and silver fell, and though more of the former were slain than he'd like, Malone was still surprised. After all the trouble they had given the Forsaken Sons during the Black Crusade, he'd expected more from the Grey Knights. It seemed Arkan's gambits had paid off after all. The leader of the Imperial Astartes, the one Asim had told them was named Koios, wasn't hard to find. In the midst of battle, his aura flared so that even a non-psyker like Malone could pick him out in the crowd. After the first 5 Forsaken Sons had fallen to his blade without landing a single blow in return, the other Chaos Marines gave him a wide berth, letting him march straight toward the center of the room. There, where the bottom of several downward slopes met, no one here was fighting on flat ground. Asim stood. The Sorcerer of Blood was serving as bait. Even though he was hidden by the pyramids, his psychic presence could still be detected, and the Grand Master was more than able to do so. The Unbound Lord and his brother attacked the Grand Master in a pincer movement, charging him as one from left and right. He reacted immediately, blocking Malone's overhead strike and kicking Igdal in the chest. Augmented with psychic power, the kick sent Igdal sliding up the nearest pyramid for several meters before he managed to maglock his boots and force himself back up. In the meantime, Malone was forced to duel the Grey Knight on his own. He barely managed to survive the first few exchanges, relying entirely on his enhanced instincts to keep up with the Grand Master. At the 5th heartbeat, he jerked his head back just in time to avoid having his skull cleaved in two. The tip of Koios' power sword caught his helmet, cracking it in 2 pieces that fell away, revealing Malone's face to the Grand Master, a face that the almost perfect mirror of the Primarch Robute Guilliman's. There was the briefest hesitation in Koios' body language, lasting barely more than 1/100th of a second, too little for Malone to take advantage of. Then the Grand Master raised his left hand, and a burst of silver fire engulfed Malone's exposed head, burning away his face. The Unbound Lord stepped back, blindly lashing out in front of him with his power sword held in one hand, the other clawing at the ruination of his features, trying to put out the flames. "Do you think," the Grey Knight snarled, the hatred in his voice audible even through the distortion of his helmet's vox speaker, "that because I wasn't here when he fell, you can?" Igdal slammed his combat knife into the back of the Grandmaster, the short blade punching through armor and bone. Behind his armored gauntlet, Malone's one remaining eye, the other had burst under the heat of Koyo's psychic fire, caught sight of the opening. Forcing himself to ignore the pain, he went on the offensive. At that exact moment, the entire wall to the right side of the Grey Knight's entry point vanished into motes of light, and the avatar of Cain that had been reported as accompanying the Eldar host strode into the room, bellowing its fury and followed by scores of Xenos warriors. So, thought Asim, this is how I die. Caught between the avatar of a dead god and the champions of a false one. Once again, the universe proved to possess a twisted sense of irony. Of course, their predicament was no coincidence. The Anchor itself was responsible, seeking to use the forces of order to eliminate one of the threats to its continued function. Unfortunately, knowing why they were doomed wasn't the same thing as knowing how to get out of this trap. The exits that weren't barred by the Grey Knights and Elders had vanished, replaced by new walls they had neither the time nor the firepower to breach. The Eldar warriors were falling upon the flank of the Forsaken Sons, attacking the ranged teams and catching the melee combatants in a pincer maneuver. Asim wasn't sure what would happen once the common enemy of the Imperials and the Xenos was gone, but it wouldn't make any difference to them. Koyos was still fighting against Igdal and Malone, but the Avatar was coming straight for Asim, its footsteps sending cracks running along the surface of the pyramids as it advanced, its burning gaze fixed upon the Sorcerer Lord. It was badly wounded, its helmet had been broken, its left arm ended at the elbow, and there was a deep gash on its chest from which droplets of lava-like blood fell in a steady stream. It was still a towering figure of hatred and death holding a sword that burned his psychic sight, while Asim had no weapon except his sacrificial dagger. He still drew it, determined to get in at least one blow before he died, and opened his second sight fully, looking for the best point of attack. As he did so, he found there was something odd about the Avatar. Something familiar. Oh. The pieces came together in Asim's mind, and the Sorcerer of Blood laughed out loud like a madman, even as the Avatar of Cain drew closer with every thunderous step. He held his dagger up, looking at his reflection in the blade. "Plus I know you are here, demon. Plus. Indeed I am, Father," replied the Herald of Blood, its horned visage flickering to replace Asim's reflection. "Long have I been waiting for this hour. Plus you know what I require. Plus. I do, and so do the gods. And what do you offer, Father, in return for this great boon?" Asim smiled. "Plus nothing. Plus. Nothing? Plus nothing. After all, if you do not accept, then you'll cease to exist as a paradox destroys you, Herald. I offer nothing but the consequences of this deed. Plus. Help me, demon," he said out loud, "or be undone." Power couldn't be destroyed. This was a fundamental law, which applied both in the materium and the immaterium. It could only be spent, turned into something else. With the Herald's assistance, Asim was breaking the Avatar of Cain down, stripping it of the psychic energy that had accumulated around its core through the devotion of the Eldar warriors of Mayan Tor, and sending that energy back in time, to where a younger Asim had stood on Parasksis Gamma, ready to make the first of many bargains with the ruinous powers in order to teleport the inmates of the penal world to another world in the system. The Avatar came apart in front of Asim, its power vanishing into the ether, until all that was left was the shard of Kala Menshik Hain that had found refuge in the craft world after the Dark Prince had killed the Eldari war god. Caught in the flow of energy, the shard was unable to return to the shrine to which it was tethered, and was swallowed by the realms of chaos, where it would be remade into the self-same spirit that had haunted Asim for decades. That haunting was over, however. This, Asim knew, for the rest of his life, which admittedly didn't look like it would last long. What with the Elders and Grey Knights still very much there and wanting him dead, he was free of his bond to the Herald of Blood. Suddenly, Asim felt another hand, a small, frail and alien hand, reach out and snatch as a fraction of the flow of power, weaving it into another spell, one similar to the one his past self was weaving. Asim blinked. He wasn't on the Anchor of Vol anymore, surrounded by foes bent on his destruction. Instead, he was, on the bridge of the Blade of Terror, with other black-clad warriors scattered across the room, in various states of injury. He saw Malone and Igdal, badly wounded from their battle against Koyos but still alive. He saw Morkoth, his black eyes wide open in shock at the sudden arrival. "Thank you, Karth Argo," the Sorcerer of Blood managed to say, before mercifully passing out. Alphon knew he couldn't beat Archon. The very idea was ridiculous. Experience might be enough to defeat the likes of the demon Astartes he had faced in the Archive of Loss, but this was a Chaos Lord, leader of a Black Crusade, swollen with the might of the ruinous powers and unlikely to underestimate his opponent. His power sword could clash against Archon's claws without being shorn asunder. At least, the relic weapon was more than resilient enough. But any direct impact would rip it from Alphon's grip. For 2 whole seconds, Alphon managed to hold his ground, then he ducked down, feeling the lightning claws pass mere centimeters away from his scalp, and rolled underneath the Chaos Lord's extended arm. Despite the weight of his power armor, the motion carried the grey spawn of long practice, and the Perpetual came up to his feet with his back turned to Archon, and ran straight for the command node in the center of the platform, covered in heretical devices. Reaching it, Alphon began to smash the unwanted additions off the pillar with his sword, while turning to look at Archon. The Awakened One was fast, despite the Terminator armor he wore, and could very well reach Alphon before he could finish the desperate ploy that was his only chance of stopping the release of the Nightmare Fleet. Somehow, despite the clearly mortal wounds he had suffered, Janus was back on his feet. The flicker of warp light surrounding him betrayed the fact his body was moving as much through telekina power as it was his own strength. Blood still flowed from the holes in his armor, though the trickle had slowed as his transhuman physiology struggled to staunch the bleeding. For a moment, less than a second, Archon hesitated, his gaze moving between Janus and Alphon. The Inquisitor was taking a gamble here, hoping that the Chaos Lord would prioritize the Supreme Grandmaster as the greater threat. Given Janus' wounds, it was possible for Archon to kill Alphon before turning to finish off Janus, but if Alphon had read Archon's plans correctly. With a roar of hatred, the Chaos Lord turned his back on Alphon and threw himself at Janus. The Inquisitor didn't know how much time the Grey Knight had bought him, but he wasn't going to waste any of it. The last piece of heretic fell off the command node, and Alphon placed his hand atop it, where the ancient Eldari smiths would have interfaced with their creation, and opened his mind. He wasn't a true psyker, but all perpetuals had a spark of psychic potential, which could be cultivated over the centuries. Having witnessed the horrors of the Age of Strife, Alphon had decided against it, which was probably to thanks for his continued survival. His soul shone less brightly than that of most perpetuals, allowing him to hide from those who had hunted his kind to extinction. With considerable effort, Alphon forced his thoughts into the language of the Eldari. The difficulty didn't just come from the fact he hadn't needed to speak the language in thousands of years. Most of it instead was because it wasn't meant for a human mind, and had in fact been designed to be as unpleasant and complex to grasp as possible. For all the Imperium's xenophobia, it was nothing compared to the levels of cold contempt Eldari had displayed for all other races through arrogance alone. Still, he managed it. He spoke to the Anchor in the tongue of its makers, and the Anchor listened. The Anchor considered the words of the old soul. Every spare bit of processing power it possessed which wasn't needed to maintain its purpose was dedicated to examining the proposal that had been made through the command terminal. First, the words were interpreted, run through the algorithms its makers had designed to allow it to understand the spirit as well as the letter of their orders. The calculations this required would have taken the cogitators of an entire Forge world 1,000 years to complete. The Anchor of all completed them in 11 milliseconds. With the proposed course of action understood, the Anchor examined it. It went against several of its secondary principles, but it did offer a chance to fulfill its purpose, and its makers had given it very few restraints where that was concerned. One by one, it ran through these restrictions. This course of action didn't endanger the Eldari Empire, for the Empire no longer existed. This was the only explanation for the lack of contact by its makers in the last thousands of cycles. It didn't put an unacceptable number of Eldari lives at risk, only the descendants of the makers who walked within it would be endangered, if they were considered Eldari at all, and there were far too few of them to be considered unacceptable. And it didn't risk the awakening of the ancient horrors, those that its makers had feared far more than the monsters it was its purpose to keep sealed away. All 3 major precepts were validated. 23 milliseconds after the proposal had been received, the Anchor accepted it, and bent its mind to make it a reality. The lights around them shifted as Alphon removed his hand from the pillar. By that point, it was little more than charred bone held together by a few tenacious strings of tendon. The agony of the energy running through it had been indescribable, and the shock would have killed anyone else instantly. But Alphon had spent 6 days in the metallic claws of the torment engines of the unnameable conglomerate during the war against the Men of Iron, and this was nothing in comparison. Even so, the shock to his nerves meant that he stumbled as he walked toward the edge of the platform, fighting for every step. His power armor had been shorted out, as he'd expected. It was why he had made sure to unlock its joints beforehand. With one last deep breath of the ozone-filled air, and a prayer to a god probably no one else in the galaxy worshipped, the Inquisitor leapt into the sphere of energy. There was a flash as his body was annihilated, and Alphon of Old Earth was no more. The anchor and the old soul became one. A mortal mind, with all the flexibility and freedom of thought, combined with the processing power and knowledge of the anchor. Still bound by the same hard restraints the makers had engraved upon it, but able to wield what freedom it did have more creatively. The Gestalt mind looked out, to the altered ships of the makers. They were too far and moving too fast to be caught again in the dimensional oubliette, but not so far as to be out of range of its mechanisms entirely. The anchor couldn't consider any course of action apart from capture, but the Gestalt could. Dimensions snapped and closed, and one by one, the demon ships were crushed and cut apart by blades that could only be seen as gravitic waves on panicking auspexes. The 2 ships of the Forsaken Sons, unfortunately, were too far to reach. The situation within the anchor was stabilized. The largest cluster of intruders had already left. Only one was left, the one who posed the greatest threat in the first place. The anchor couldn't enjoy what was about to happen. But the Gestalt mind very much could. The corpse of Janus laid on the ground behind him. Archon had chosen to take his time making sure the Supreme Grand Master was dead, and that there was nothing that could be done to restore him. That part of his goals had been accomplished, and nothing would change that, but right now, he doubted he'd have the chance to fulfill the rest. Facing a newborn godling in the heart of its power had that kind of effect on plans. The Chaos Lord watched with wide eyes as a humanoid figure of pure light emerged from the sphere. It looked down upon him, and for the first time in centuries, despite all the power that churned within him, the awakened one felt helpless. The figure snapped its fingers, and Archon burned in stolen starfire, until nothing was left. The warp. Date unavailable. He is still burning as he falls. Around him, the realms of chaos stretch into infinity. This is the doom of Archon of Chthoniya, the awakened one, as his soul slips from his flesh and into the waiting grasp of the dark gods to whom he swore himself in return for the power to accomplish his goals. He sees the blade of terror and the eidolon of regret flee to the edge of the artificial system and plunge into the warp. Far from the warp lanes of Azeroth, it will take them a long time to find their way to another star. Already the eidolon is pulling away from the blade, seeking to return to the Hellforge of Argenta Primus. Guided by Arsum and Carthago's ghost, the demon ship won't emerge from the warp for centuries, but it will emerge eventually, and the Imperium will rue the day its Grey Knights failed to kill the 2 chosen on board. He sees the corpse of Janus delivered to Goio's feet. He sees the grief of the Grand Master, and the retreat of the Imperial forces from the anchor. He sees those few heirs of Sanguinius who lived through the battle, and those guardsmen who have survived plague and fire, not knowing they must now face the trials of the Inquisition. Few will be judged pure and untainted, and of them none will return to their former lives, for there is knowledge the Ordosh won't allow to spread. He sees the elders of Myantor depart, not yet knowing that their Craftworld's Shrine of Cain now stands empty, and shall do so forevermore. A shard of their dead god has been stolen and reforged by Khorne's machinations, and those who walk the warrior paths shall be diminished without it. He sees the Herald of Blood, born of paradox and mirroring bargains. The voice of Khorne, whispering into the ear of sorcerers in the place of the Lord of Skulls, forging the pacts by which greater blood may be spilled. The hypocrisy of the blood god does not surprise him, for all of the 4 are liars. He sees the unnatural alliance of the elders with the Imperium ending, and their clever Farseer orders an immediate departure, before the Imperial commander's ingrained loathing of the Xenos can reassert itself. Silent and stunned, their autarch follows along, his heart broken by having been made to confront the truth of his ancestors. The descent he sought to avoid is inevitable now. He sees the Azeroth sector, and the Imperial retribution forces pouring into it through Beranos. One by one, its worlds are liberated, the cultists and war hosts of the Black Crusade slaughtered in brutal campaigns, and then, As the citizens rejoice, their liberators turn on them, purging all who bear even the slightest possibility of taint. In the depths of Achilles, he sees something grow from the interrupted experiments of an heretic called the Spider. Even as the world is liberated and the houses who took the unfettered gifts are hunted down to the last, this unintended legacy lingers, hidden from sight, a seed awaiting rain to grow and blossom. He sees Orpheus and his brothers in service to the youngest god, taking what pleasures they can find amidst the mayhem before returning to the wailing storm. He sees the prison of Serexithar, forged of his pact with the dark gods to sustain the wailing storm. It endures, despite the efforts of the demon prince of Zionj to escape his bonds. The wailing storm will continue to plague Segmentum Obscurus for millennia to come, a haven for the heretics of Azeroth and the neighboring sectors. And in the depths of the anchor, he sees a demon-faced figure rise, broken but alive. Then, before he can see anything else, the vision is cut off, as the anchor slips sideways through time, dragged beyond even the eyes of the dark gods by the power of its engines wielded by the ancient mind of the Perpetual. With it vanishes the hope of releasing the Nightmare Fleet upon the galaxy. Yet Harkon is satisfied. Janus is dead. He has accomplished his task, the one Abaddon gave him when they spoke. He has done something that matters, something which will influence the course of the long war for millennia to come. Now is the time to pay the price of that victory, which he has already made so many others pay in his stead. But the price isn't what he thought it was. When he made the pact with the dark gods, he believed that the price he would pay would be eternal torment, his soul consumed in the fires of chaos until nothing remained but a single point of agony. And this was a fate he accepted. Such are the depths of his hatred for the Imperium he once helped build. But he was wrong. Such will not be his fate, he sees it now, with something approaching horror. These are the wages of treachery. This is the fate waiting at the end of the path to glory. This is the price of the dark gods' help in killing Janus, for all that the Four very much wanted him dead as well. He will serve them. He will be remade into their instrument, a tool with which they will fight their meaningless wars in the Empyrean. He will lead and he will serve, and bring ruin and damnation to Xeno's species that have only just awakened to the existence of the Immaterium. He will dance from one set of strings to another, leading the hordes of one power and then its rivals, fighting under one banner only to fight against it the next dawn. He sees that he, who sacrificed everything to fight a war that mattered, will be made to take part endlessly in the petty moves of the great game. And, cruelest of all, he sees the hope of liberation, forever dangled just out of his reach, to drive him to give his best to his God's appointed task. A false hope, but one he will never be able to help himself long for. Cadia, 999. M41. Hundreds, thousands of warships fought in the skies of Cadia. The 13th Black Crusade raged, and the world that had held the hordes of the Despoiler at bay for thousands of years stood on the verge of ruin. From the Eye of Terror, Abaddon, who had once been first captain to Horus Lupercal but was now Warmaster of Chaos and greatest of the Dark Gods' champions, as well as the one soul they desired most for their own, had emerged, leading the greatest coalition of traitor legions, renegades and heretics the galaxy had seen since the days of the heresy. The last fortresses of Cadia struggled against the unceasing onslaught of the Despoiler's forces, millions of guardsmen bravely holding the line against impossible odds, supported by the scattered survivors of the Space Marine chapters who had come to their aid. Strange miracles occurred, as a living saint returned to life and an antediluvian Xeno's abomination briefly made common cause with the heroes of humanity. Not even Abaddon could deny their courage and valor, and the fury of the Warmaster grew, until he decided he had had enough. At the Despoiler's command, the Blackstone Fortress Well of Eternity was hurled at the planet, sundering it and bringing to ruin the fortress world that had stood vigil at the gate of hell for thousands of years. The Cadian pylons, ancient mechanisms that had held the Eye of Terror in check since its formation at the fall of the Dari Empire, were obliterated. In that moment, the last part of the millennia-spanning scheme by the Warmaster was completed. Throughout the Long War, Abaddon had targeted those worlds where, unbeknownst to the Imperium, more of these ancient pylons had stood, reinforcing the barrier between Materium and Immaterium. For all of the Warmaster's refusal to kneel to the Chaos Gods, Abaddon still sought to make use of its power to fulfill his own ambition. The ancient network, whose construction none living or unliving now remembered, snapped under the strain, and the galaxy burned. The Cicatrix Maledictum opened, tearing the Milky Way in two, while uncounted warp storms raged, swallowing systems whole and spitting out all manners of horrors to plague the now isolated worlds of the Imperium. It was the death knell of an age, and the herald of a new one beginning, one that would leave the galaxy a much different place. The wheel of history, which had seemingly calcified into a stasis of unending, bloody warfare where nothing was achieved, finally began to turn once more. In the years to come, epochal events would shake the stars, many forces attempting to shape them to their advantage. But in the fury of Cadia's death throes, hidden in the shadows of history, a long-awaited reunion was about to take place. Only a handful of ships managed to flee from Cadia as it died, and though they bore the hope of the Imperium within their holds, they couldn't save all the heroes who had remained on the planet. Even as the ships of the Black Legion lit up their engines in pursuit, there were still battles being waged on the broken world, as small pockets of Imperial resistance fought the hordes of demons and the lost and the damned who had been abandoned. What few aircraft still flew in Cadia's burning atmosphere were either speeding for the void as fast as they could or trying to recover some of the planet-side assets that any of the lords in orbit had deemed worth the attempt to salvage. Only one carried a handful of warriors down to the broken world, descending toward a ruined Cosa where the survivors of a dozen regiments had banded together to make a last stand against the demonic hordes surging from the cracks of the dying planet in an unending tide. Yet when the Thunderhawk managed to land on what had once been a mustering plaza, the sounds of battle had ended, and an ominous silence hung over the Cosa, broken only by the dying sounds of Cadia. 4 figures in black and gold power armor emerged from the Thunderhawk, each bearing the emblem of the Black Legion on their pauldron. They walked through the ruined city, the demons that lurked within its shadows keeping clear of them, for each of the 4 was mighty in the eyes of the Pantheon, and more than capable of dealing with the scavengers of the warp who had come to feed upon the death of Cadia. The 4 reached the Imperial Cathedral where the last of the defenders had made their last stand. Like the rest of the city, it laid in ruins, and the corpses of its fallen defenders were scattered around in gory pieces. Some of their uniforms were still recognizable: Cadian shock troopers, Gendragoons, Mordian Iron Guards, all were united in death, their bodies torn apart and their blood painted on the broken Gothic architecture. And there, waiting for them at the center of the desecrated holy grounds, stood their quarry. He, was tall, almost 5 meters high despite being hunched down. Black armor parted to reveal corpse-pale flesh, and a pair of bat-like wings of the same hue stretched from his back. Spiked golden chains marked with demonic runes circled around his torso and limbs, glowing with power but not restricting his movement, at least not in the material plane. His feet were hooves wreathed in warp fire that left smoldering tracks, and his arms ended in long, vicious claws. His face was a mask of horrors that constantly shifted, save for the 2 blazing eyes which shone with an eldritch radiance that gave off no warmth. "My Lord Archon," greeted Asim, kneeling before the demon prince of Chaos Undivided. "Asim," growled the awakened one, tossing aside the torso of an Imperial commissar he had been chewing on. His burning gaze passed over each of the Black Legionnaires in turn. Inside their armor, they shivered as he spoke their name, feeling their very soul quake as ancient bonds of command were reignited. Malone, Igdil, Orpheus, and Carthago. His gaze paused somewhere over Asim's shoulder, where the air briefly rippled, revealing the translucent form of the Xenos Psyker's shade. "You still endure, after all this time?" "Yes, Lord," replied Malone, bowing. "And so does our brother Morkoth. He is aboard the Blade of Terror, waiting for us in the void. We have a few of the old Forsaken Sons there too, though as you can see," he tapped the Eye of Horus on his pauldron, "we have joined up with Warmaster Abaddon." The demon prince grunted something that could be interpreted as acceptance. "Times change," he said. "I expected as much. Do any more of my chosen yet live?" "Dekaros is still alive," answered Igdil, "though it's been decades since we last saw him in person." "Where is he? Where is the Lord of Shadows?" "Last I heard, he was somewhere in Segmentum Pacificus, Lord. Things there are complicated." "I shall call him to me, then. We must return to Azeroth, brothers. The anchor of all has returned to reality once more, shaken from its hiding place by the opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum." "That's going to be difficult, Lord," pointed out Malone. "The situation is still evolving, but when we came down here it seemed Azeroth was on the other side of the rift." "We shall sail directly through the rift itself," Malone replied Archon, his face briefly contorting into something like a smile. All of the realms in between are connected through it now. I will guide us across its burning tides, to the wailing storm. The lamentation awaits us there, as do the descendants of our old allies. I shall remind them of the pacts their ancestors swore, and from them we shall gather a new army. The War Master has his own plans for the Black Legion, Lord, said Orpheus with a smile. He might disapprove of you taking assets away from his campaign. Abaddon knows that he cannot hold all of the forces here now that the gate has fallen. Dispersal is inevitable, and he will have planned for it. Besides, we'll still be fulfilling his command, only 9,000 years late. His Black Crusade can do without one single ship, I think. Whatever they thought of this, none of the 4 Chaos Marines argued the point. Azeroth has forgotten us, but we'll remind the Imperials of the terror we once inflicted upon them, continued the Demon Prince. The path to nightmares is shut, so we'll need to find another way to the anchor. To that end, something waits for us on Achilles, born of the discarded and forgotten seeds of the unfettered experiments. It will guide us to our destination. And in the anchor itself, our old friend Mercurian still endures. He's still alive? Blurted out Malone. Yes. Now that the anchor has returned to reality, I can feel his soulfire. Somehow, I do not know how, he has managed to survive the anchor's temporal displacement. His knowledge will be of great use to us when we break the anchor and free the Nightmare Fleet. So you still intend to pursue that scheme, then? Malone asked for the sake of clarity. Yes. This is our age, brothers. The might of the false emperor has been broken, his empire of lies sundered. The hour of the legions has come at last, and the dark gods have freed me from my servitude. I intend to finish what I began so long ago. Arkan threw his head up, looking at the warp-torn skies. The Imperium burns, but it is not dead yet. And I want to hear it scream my name before the end. And from Tsar Ariel, here we are at last. Over 7 years after I started writing this story, it is finally complete. I did rush the writing of the ending, because, well, I am a bit tired of this story, honestly, and I want to be able to think of happier things when I go celebrate the holidays with my family in a few hours. Looking back, there are a lot of things I wish I had done differently, but then, the purpose of writing this, apart from I want to read more Chaos Marine stories, was to gain experience. The main bit of advice I would get from it and give to any fellow aspiring writers would be, keep a list of all your characters with a description of what they look like / what their equipment is for quick reference. Now that this story is complete, I plan to spend some time writing a Blade recast, since it hasn't been updated since September and it is my most popular story. I will have to finish Prince of the Eye at some point as well, even if I'm aware it's the least read of my works. I just don't want to leave any of my stories permanently hanging. Considering how this story ends, I might write a sequel one day, set in the 42nd millennium. After all, we know very little of what is happening in Imperium Nihilus. For all we know, there is a fleet of Dark Age demon ships released from stasis by a demon prince of the Black Legion rampaging around. Thank you all for reading this far, and I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I enjoyed writing it.